So at the beginning of the pandemic, one of the most notable changes to many American lifestyles was how families obtained and consumed food. Early headlines in March of 2020 discussed hoarding of household items and the near collapse of the restaurant industry. Fears of scarcity increased demand for products, just as retailers and organizations were seeing the effects of a tightened supply chain. Decreases in labor resulted in a decrease in overall production, making it difficult for some retailers to keep up with that demand. However, even if products were available, many retailers and organizations found that decreases in shipping and transportation made it difficult to obtain products in a timely manner. When so many organizations depend on labor and food products, how can they meet the needs of their consumers? Today, we'll hear from three individuals representing organizations in the Cincinnati area that have successfully pivoted to adopt new strategies to meet these needs of the consumer population and our community here in Cincinnati during this pandemic. Together, these organizations have reinforced that idea that food is essential, and we're really excited to hear more about their journeys in navigating the challenges of this pandemic. So I'd like to introduce our three panelists here. They are from a variety of organizations in the food industry here in Cincinnati. We've got Sean Brislin, who's representing Kroger. We've got Michael Truitt, who is representing the Freestore Food Bank, which is a nonprofit. And then we've got Suzy DeYoung, who represents a nonprofit, Soupe, here in the Cincinnati community as well. So we're so grateful that you all are here today to kind of share a little bit about your experiences in navigating these challenges. And I'd like to start us off with just a little bit more of an introduction of what you all do, so we can get a sense of the differences in strategies that you guys might have taken with this pandemic. So Sean, we'll start with you. Can you tell us a little bit more about your title at Kroger and what you do there?
Yeah, thanks, Erica, and thanks everyone for having me. Good afternoon. My name is Sean Brislin. I'm the Director of Deli Prepared Foods Merchandising, Culinary, and Hospitality. So what merchandising means in the Kroger world is anything to do with what we call the 4 Ps of marketing. That's price, product, promotion, and placement. So anything to do with the products that we sell in our stores and how we position them. I'm also responsible for our Culinary Innovation Center, which has chefs that are employed by the Kroger company and also partner organizations that help develop new and innovative fresh food items. And then here at Kroger, we have 3 area restaurants called 1883, and I manage those teams that run those restaurants.
Thanks so much, Sean. And Michael, can you tell us a little bit more about what you do at the Freestore Food Bank?
Yes, my job title is the Director of Community Partnerships and Programs at the Freestore Food Bank. Most people know the food bank or a food bank in their city for their direct service. In our world, that's called a food pantry, soup kitchen, homeless shelter, something along those lines. But most people know the food bank as a food pantry. But realistically, that's only about 7% of the food we distribute. The other 93% of that product, we act as supply chain and logistics for, in our language, 500 plus food access points. So those are our partner food pantries, soup kitchens, schools, hospitals, etc. So in a for-profit world, I'd have a job title very similar to Director of Sales and Marketing. But I oversee the relationships with all these pantries and then navigating the demand side of the supply chain. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Michael. And Suzy, can you tell us a little bit more about Soupe and how you founded that organization?
Hi, Erica. Thank you for having me. I am a chef by trade, so I had a catering company for 25 years. I retired and sold that company and started Soupe, using my chef skills and using a chef-driven model, meaning what we do is we rescue the food from places like a Kroger, that it's past its prime, but perfectly good food. And we transform that and distribute that to the food insecure within Cincinnati. So we use a lot of the same partners at the Freestore Food Bank, the same pantries, but the products that we give are created here in the city. They're mostly soups, but we also do family meals and single meals for elderly people.
Perfect. And we like how you guys are all interconnected, even though your organization's of different sizes. So that's great to have. So I want to get into some questions here related to our topic. So we're going to kind of kick things off by going back in time a little bit to the beginning of the pandemic. For our purposes, we're just going to say March of 2020. And if you can think about kind of your response back in March versus kind of during the pandemic and where we are now, I want to start off with Sean from the Kroger perspective, and then we'll kind of narrow on down. So Sean, what trends did you see in terms of customers using your resources there at Kroger in terms of demand for products at the beginning of the pandemic, and how have these trends kind of changed as we progress throughout the pandemic?
Yeah, needless to say, for anybody who lives in the area and hopefully you shop our stores, we saw an immediate and dramatic shift in how consumers, shop for products and what they look for. What that really means is consumers shifted from consuming most of their food at home and really reduced in the way that they consume food away from home. Meaning, historically, about half the food is consumed at home and half is consumed at restaurants or quick service restaurants, and that changed dramatically to almost entirely being consumed at home. So this led to a significant increase in demand for all items in our stores, but particularly on things like household items, paper products, cleaning items, like dry grocery products that you can stock up on, and then fresh items like meat and produce. So customers stocked up on many items as they prepared potentially to quarantine, and they tried to limit trips in order to reduce their interaction with the public. We also saw a very large increase in online shopping and customers using our pickup service. Since the height of the pandemic, many customer behaviors have returned to this kind of new normal that we talk about, but they've not entirely shifted back to the way that they shopped pre-pandemic, because many people are still working remotely, traveling less, and also, of course, experiencing different COVID spikes and situations in their communities. So not entirely back to the way that the pre-pandemic shopping behaviors were, but slowly starting to get there.
Awesome, thank you. And I think a lot of folks in Cincinnati can relate to that online shopping experience. I know that was really popular during the pandemic and might be popular for Kroger even post-pandemic. I don't know, Suzy or Michael, did you want to kind of chime in here? Did you see an increase in the needs of your services at the beginning of the pandemic versus now, or what have those trends been like for either of you?
For Le Soupe, I think on the rescue side, it was actually that March is when we had this, in Ohio, the restaurants were closed. And having been a chef, all the restaurant chefs were calling us after they gave their food away to as much as they could give to their employees. We were picking up from literally every restaurant. I can't even describe what it was like. And if you knew where we were located at the time, we were in 900 square feet. So it was clearly we couldn't social distance, we couldn't keep our staff safe. And by the grace of God, one of the restaurants that came down and brought us their food, the owner said, maybe you should take our space. It's huge. We're in Blue Ash. We've got 6 rooms. We have a huge kitchen. We can't function. So why don't you come in and take over? So we saw the supply chain in the beginning. It was the independent restaurants that we had a lot of food from. And immediately my thought was, well, what's going to happen to the Cisco's, the Chef Warehouse, the Gordon food service trucks that we're going to be delivering to those restaurants? What's going to happen to that food? And that was answered probably 2 days later when they started calling, asking us to take this food off their hands before they had to throw it away. So to say it was nutso is an understatement. We just kind of did what we had to do, and we figured out systems the best that we could and just kept producing the best that we could. Couldn't have done it without the gift of Firehouse Grill that our new space where we're presently located was not finished yet. So We weren't able to move into the new space until June. So we moved twice during a pandemic. I don't think many people can claim that. It was pretty nuts. So,
Wow. Yeah, and so it sounds like, we were seeing an increase in demand over at Kroger, and then restaurants are closing at the same time. So you've got different problems to deal with. And then I want to get back to another initiative of yours at Soupe here, but I'm going to go to Michael. Over at Free Store Food Bank, did you see an increase in the need of services at Free Store and the surrounding pantries in March, or what were you seeing?
Yeah, absolutely. As the lockdown initially hit, a lot of the internal and external efforts that first week or so really revolved around the fact that schools closed. A lot of people were very concerned about how are we going to feed the children first and foremost. So a lot of effort initially went into providing structures. And what we found was that each community was solving their own problem in their own way, which is, the ideal solution, but the solutions weren't always the same. So there needed to be a lot of flexibility in a supply chain that was already strained. Some schools were doing direct deliveries. Some wanted us to deliver to the school. Some pantries stepped up to kind of help solve things almost from like a programmatic perspective. When we looked at the aggregate within the first month or two, we saw the need for our goods and services nearly double within the first month or so. Without getting into too many of the details, we have control of about 10% of our supply chain. So it really strained kind of our operations to scale up in an environment when the supply chain is already strained and we've got limited control over that. So demand skyrocketed, the need skyrocketed pretty quickly. And as we know, the leading economic indicator for food insecurity is unemployment, and that certainly lagged for a number of months and still isn't quite up to pre-pandemic levels. So while there certainly have been ebbs and flows, it's been a fairly consistent elevated need from February of 2020 as our kind of baseline.
Thanks, Michael. I want to get back into the supply chain here a little bit later, but Suzy, I want to go back to you relative to what you said about the restaurant industry. So we know that restaurants had to close down and they were dealing with, how do we get rid of all of this food and make it useful? But what else were you doing for restaurants that, had to lay off workers or completely close down? I know you started a new initiative over at Soupe. Can you tell us?
We started what we called the Community Kitchen Program. I had done work in 3 or 4 different cities for World Central Kitchen. That's an agency that goes, it's run by a chef. It's a chef-driven model that feeds people in natural disasters. So after a tornado, hurricane, flood, Jose Andres' team, and I'm part of that team. So I've gone on many, I call them my mission trips, to other cities to help cook, on site in a natural disaster area. So we kind of took that model, and I ended up the same chefs that called me with their food. I called back and said, what would it take if you're going to try to survive on carry out, which they were allowed to do carry out at the time. If you're going to go that route, if we could pay you to make food for us, and like Michael said, there were so many different schools doing different things. Our answer was, if a parent came to a school to pick up the provided meals by the school, we could provide a family meal or a soup that could go home with that child as well, or the parent picking up their kid's lunch, then the whole family would be fed. And we ended up with about 28 restaurants that we paid. So we were trying to help them keep their doors open by supplying them with the food that we had rescued, have them cook it, and they would freeze it, and then we would distribute it. So we ended up serving about a million servings of that food through that year. And, most importantly for me was trying to come up with a way to keep these chefs working and their doors open. It wasn't a ton of money for any of them, but it was just enough to be a little bit of a buffer for, for them, if they're going to try to feed people on carry out, to know that they were going to still do 500 family meals a week. And we really tried to coordinate it with the restaurant being in the neighborhood, and that worked really well, because then the neighborhood had, like Michael said, they had the feeling that their own community was taking care of their community. They know this little barbecue restaurant, and now they're getting a free meal from the barbecue restaurant. So I think at a time of uncertainty for so many, it was just a nice personal approach to food and eating, and showed that people cared. So it worked.
That's awesome work.
Yeah,
Thanks for
it's fun.
sharing that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I want to pivot here to, now we have this increase in demand. How do we get the product to the consumer? So we kind of want to pivot over to the supply chain side of things here. And I know this is something that we've seen in the news constantly, but there are so many different aspects to the supply chain. It looks different for different industries. So I want to go to the Kroger perspective from the corporate side. So Sean, can you give us an example of some of the specific supply chain issues that you see in your area of Kroger?
Yeah, absolutely. As the as the largest traditional food retailer, we've always been accustomed to suppliers being really flexible to meet our needs. We've now really been challenged to adopt new ways of working with our suppliers and be more flexible to their needs. As an example, things like product innovation and enhanced variety really tapered off, especially at the height of the pandemic. Due to having to focus more on a supplier's core assortment, we needed to allow their manufacturing plants to run at maximum efficiencies, to meet customer demand. A year ago, it was because, people were obviously getting sick, not coming into work, or people were fearful about getting COVID, at work. And now the issue is just an overall lack of labor, not only within the manufacturing plants, but within the supply chain, especially on logistics. I think the latest report I saw that there are something like, 80,000 truck drivers needed to fulfill today's current demand. One of the other areas that really transformed with us is, there had been a large focus on promotions and price discounts, and really, suppliers couldn't keep up, with any sort of spike in demand. They really needed to just have, a level set on any type of production that they had. Those spikes would really cripple them due to these labor shortages and also due to these logistical challenges. The other factor really involved in this is, cost of goods have risen due to all these factors I mentioned with labor and logistics, but also along with I think we've all heard of the many issues facing our ports. And in turn, that causes us, to get higher cost of goods from the suppliers, and then to turn around and have to raise our costs to make up for that. So definitely product availability right now is our most pressing issue and our focus in our day-to-day work. And also as our supply bases consolidate to more larger kind of multinational suppliers that can service the demand a company the size of Kroger, we really have to focus in on partnerships and how we work with them day to day. Suppliers want their purchase orders up to 2 times longer than their normal lead times. And they also want forecasts for our needs much longer in advance. So forecasting demand for product is essential in these partnerships in order to maximize their efficiencies, to keep up with our logistics network, and ultimately so our individual stores can get products onto the shelf.
Thanks, Sean. That's a lot of different factors to juggle, and we'll go back to some of those here in a moment. Now, on the Free Store Food Bank side of things, did you see any specific supply chain issues? I know you also have a government relationship with some of the different agencies in terms of how you get your product. So what specific supply chain challenges did you see, Mike?
So yeah, actually, now would be a good time to pull up the infographic, James, just so I can kind of reference it and people can kind of see the numbers I'm speaking to. One of the initial challenges that we had is that you can see at the bottom pie chart, if we go over if we take a step back and look at what a supply chain is, it's how we get product from point A to point B. And so when we talk about the Free Store Food Bank, the barriers that we face are kind of our supply chain as we have raw materials, that's food. Then we have our suppliers, and that's when we, that's kind of more of the perspective that we take. So in a non-COVID year, we have about 60% of our food comes from the USDA. There's a veritable alphabet soup of programs, everything that serves children, seniors, the general public, etc. Most of that is set in federal budgets that get allocated amongst the states and counties as fair share. Then you see about 30% of food is donated in some capacity. 15% of that is our traditional donations. So what we like to say is Halloween's coming up. So there's going to be Halloween themed Cheerios. On November 1st, Kroger's warehouse is going to have some pallets of extra cereal that just didn't move in time. They don't always want to sell it, so they'll donate it to us. Another 15% is what we call food rescue. That's your manager special at Kroger's, or the store has 3 pallets of potatoes, but it's on pace only to sell 2. So they'll donate that extra one to us before it goes bad. And then that last 10%, we purchase the product. So we really can't go to Kroger in a time of need, especially in COVID, and say, hey, I know you've been great about donating, but do you have extra product for us when they're having supply chain disruptions? So not only do we not have control over the USDA, now our donations have been cut sometimes in third to a quarter. So the only way for us really to meet the demand was to purchase the food. But as you can imagine, Free Store Food Bank is a relatively small nonprofit when you compare it to your Kroger's and other major retailers. So we don't have purchasing powers. We don't have the credit. We don't have the ability to forecast out that far. All the issues that Kroger was having, multiply that or divide that, whatever that may be on ours, because we just don't have that same power. So when it came to as COVID first hit, we really struggled. At one point, we had enough food in our warehouse for a week and a half because the demand hit and we hadn't been able to restock our shelves. Luckily on our end, it was coming down to the wire. We were really trying to figure out what to do and if we needed to kind of ration our supply chain. But right around that time, as restaurants were closing, as schools were closing, the USDA had stepped in. There was still food in the system in some capacity, food that was going to make its way to your Sysco's in a week, or food that were going to make its way to the schools. And what the USDA had done was step up their funding through primarily what was known as the Farmers to Family program. Those were large scale distributions of boxes that were pre-made with a variety of products. And they had stepped up and increased the amount of product that they were distributing almost by about 10 million meals additionally over the course of COVID through the beginning of this year, that we had seen additional elements in the supply chain. So that restocked our shelves, but we still then face the barrier. So that third link in our supply chain is what the Free Store does. As I had mentioned, we do some warehousing and logistics. And then how did we serve families? We'll get to some of the changes in the distribution models, but as you can imagine, a lot of food pantry soup kitchens are very volunteer driven. When you look at the demographics of volunteers, you tend to not see young and healthy. You tend to see people who are more comfortable in their socioeconomic status, the elderly, the retired, those that were most at risk, and those were being told to stay at home, shelter in place, and if they were at risk, were at greater risk. So at one point, 20% of our food access points were closed just as their programmatic nature. Those are the schools. Hospitals were on lockdown, so that's another about 5 or 10%, and about 20 to 25% of our food pantries and soup kitchens that we supported were closed in some capacity. So while we're trying to navigate disruptions amongst the second link in that supply chain, we're trying to adapt to modifications within the 4 walls of the Free Store, if you will, and we're also having all sorts of disruption amongst kind of the distribution network, the food access points that we serve, those who serve. So we were innovating on a daily basis from a lot of different perspectives.
Great. Awesome. Thank you, Michael. I do want to switch over to Suzy because you do other initiatives at La Soupe other than the community kitchen. And did the supply chain issues that we're experiencing in 2020, 2021 affect you at all over at La Soupe?
Well, we're much, 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 much smaller than the Free Store Food Bank. So, you know, we don't have 500 agencies we're trying to keep stocked. And because the very nature of our business has always been built on the rescue side of things, meaning, you know, we really don't buy food. And sorry, Kroger, that's not really what you like to hear, but we try not to. We buy a lot of paper goods, but so luckily for us, a lot of local farmers know us. A lot of local just gardeners know us. And so during the summer months, we were getting flooded with local tomatoes and local produce from just good people that, you know, anybody that puts a zucchini plant in for the first time does not know that they will have enough for the entire street. So we had lots of people bringing us food. And we had a couple food drives people did for us for the staple items, the pastas and the rice and those type, you know, the shelf stable stuff that we will use if we have it. So, you know, on the supply chain side, we kind of just say, if you think about it, it'll show up. So that's our motto. Just start thinking about it. Somebody yesterday said something about cauliflower. So collectively, the group of 20 in the kitchen all said, okay, everybody start thinking about cauliflower. And I kid you not, it showed up at the back door. So we don't, you know, because our whole model is based on whatever we get, we do the best we can to turn it into something. We might have had to get a little more creative with trying to create some meals, but we do have one extraordinarily huge purveyor, which supplies pretty much all our meats for us. They're a co-packer. So, and their supply chain, because they had so much in inventory that they were going to have to get rid of anyway, because the restaurants were closed. We were picking up all of that. I thought one of the more interesting things that I was just in New York City with a group that does very similar work to us. We went out for dinner. And in New York City, when they closed down, because this chef is very well known in the city, he was saying that the rooms that have dry age rooms, that because nobody knew if this is going to be a month or 2 months or 3 months. And so any of these really high-end steakhouses were still dry aging their meat. And he said, we got to the point that our staff was like, if we have to eat like one more, we call $1 million steak, like they had so much meat product, so much high-end product, because people were still buying it in the restaurants with hopes that it'll be ready to go in a month or in 2 months, and they'll have the supply chain that they need. So we didn't see that as much here, but I thought that was really interesting to think that restaurants, you know, I forget that they were trying to think, okay, in 3 months' time, I better put my order in. If I have a dry age room, I better get it going, because in 3 months we might be open. So we didn't have that here, but apparently other places did.
And that's a good point. You know, different industries are going to experience different demands. And I really like the fact that all three of you illustrate that, you know, you see kind of an excess of product and then also some instances where you can't get it fast enough. So definitely was telling of 2020 and 2021.
So too, when Michael, when you were talking about the farm to family program, I mean, in the beginning, it seemed like an awesome, incredibly awesome idea. But towards the end, it just became like, if we got one more darn box by people calling saying like, there's 40 boxes left and nobody showed up for us to distribute, it was like, nobody's fault. I mean, it's like the government did what they thought was the best thing, but the distribution of that food was just hard to, you know, I think we got apples, and that's probably how we did it. Now that I think back, I think everybody had apples and potatoes, and I can't think what else was in those boxes, but we did utilize a lot of the farm to table boxes, a lot.
I think my therapist knows way more about the Farmers to Family program than they ought to. That
Yeah.
was
Yes.
provided a lot of good, but there was a lot of
It was a
back-end work
really
that
great
needed to be
out of the
done.
box moment of thinking. It
Mhm.
just didn't, they didn't think it through to the very end. It had, I commend the government for pivoting quickly and getting it and making it happen. There were a lot of problems. So, but we all know that hindsight's 2020. So,
Absolutely. Right. I want to switch over to the price side of things because I know that's something that affects everyone. And Kroger, with Sean, I want to start with you because you're in a really unique position economically. You want to get the best prices for your Kroger customers, but you're also answering to shareholders that worry about Kroger's profitability. So with a lot of things out in the news about, fears of inflation or all of these supply chain and logistical issues driving up costs, what are some of the specific areas where you've seen rising costs? And what are some of the things that Kroger's doing to kind of mitigate those costs?
Yeah, obviously, the U.S. as a whole has experienced probably the most meaningful and sustainable inflation that I've seen in my career, which are driven by the factors that I mentioned earlier, the labor shortages, rising logistics and production costs, you name it. I mean, significant inflation happens when it's not just one factor driving it, but multiple factors all at once. So when you look at some of the important gauges, there's one that the Federal Reserve really looks at, hit a 30-year high, which is called the Personal Consumption Expenditure Index, was recently plus 4.5%, which is really significant. And then we look at a global standpoint, there's an index called the FAO Real Food Price Index, also hit a 30-year high. So we're talking about highest inflation rates we've seen in 30 years, and it all coming at once from multiple places. As I mentioned, number one, increasing labor costs. Wages have increased over the last 2 years, and the trend is expected to continue. In a lot of ways, that's a good thing, but it definitely has an impact on the cost of goods. Since 2019, the Producer Price Index, which measures the cost of labor, has increased 5.8%. You can definitely, anywhere you're driving down a road or looking at the side of a warehouse, you see signs for help wanted, starting rates for help, flexible hours, more benefits. Companies are really needing to be more competitive in the marketplace to compete for workers. I mentioned the problem earlier that we're having with truck drivers is a major need out there. Number two is increasing logistics costs. So you have the lack of drivers, you have the need to elevate their wages, their equipment costs more, warehousing costs are more, and there's also tightened industry capacity. These have all contributed to the increased cost in logistics. The number three, production costs. So you think about utilities, things like natural gas and fuel are on the rise. Packaging costs, when you think about packaging, most packaging is actually made from petroleum. So when the price of oil goes up, the price of packaging goes up as well. You think about ingredient costs, ingredients that go into the goods have risen the past 2 years. And all these things are forecasted to continue to rise, well into 2022. Another major factor for us on the food side of things is rising commodity markets. We've seen a lot of widespread increases in commodities driven by the same things, labor shortages, and then rising feed costs. The biggest input to, meat or seafood and any protein that we sell is the cost of the feed, right? The cost of the grain that the animal consumes. There's been significant global protein demand, during the same time period as well, while the inventory positions here at the United States remain very depleted by historical standards. So the demand for export is greater, but the inventory that we have today is less than it's ever been. The major input costs for raising animals, and really anything that goes into any packaged products that you consume, is really around corn and soybeans, are at very high levels. You look at corn, corn is up 42% year to date versus last year. Soybeans is only up 3% versus last year, but up over 54% on a 3-year average. So once again, strong global demand is creating tighter supply. Even though U.S. planted acres of corn and soybeans are up, so there's more of it, there's still price volatility out there in the market, which is driven by weather and the timing and ability to impact harvest. Weather is the big unknown, when we have major weather events. So some of those international demands, definitely export demand coming from China in particular. Part of that is we're seeing lower crop yields in South America. They export a lot to China. So when they don't have as good of yields in their production, then China looks to the US for more. And once again, weather, droughts throughout major parts of the world that grow a lot of these products that go into the packaged goods we sell, continue to impact the price. So all these impacts are what causes inflation, and why, as I mentioned, inflation is forecasted to continue into 2022.
Thanks, Sean. I know a lot of folks, go to a grocer and realize the prices are high, but really don't think about all those factors that are driving those prices up. So that's very helpful, those statistics that you shared there. Now, on the Free Store Food Bank side, did you also see rising prices from your suppliers, Mike, or what were you seeing?
He said, so we struggle with the fact that we don't have purchasing power, and we don't have, our dollar is probably commas lower than what Kroger's supply chain is dealing with. So there were numerous times the lead time, or the amount of time it takes from us to order the product to when we expect it to arrive, is normally a week or two, was going months out. So we're looking at a warehouse that's depleting at an unprecedented rate. Meanwhile, it's longer for us to get it. And we know that even if a supplier charges us $1 for that can of corn, tomorrow they can say someone just paid me $1.50. So sorry, Kroger needs it. And so we were seeing our orders being cut, our orders being delayed, outright eliminated, or they'll call back and say, yeah, we don't have corn, but do you want green beans? And for probably the first 3 to 6 months, it really was just a what can you get me, and I'm happy with it model of food sourcing and procurement, rather than any sort of strategic thing for us, because we were seeing prices skyrocket. And when you look at the hierarchy of where we sit for our suppliers, we're purchasing from a lot of the same higher level suppliers as all the retailers are. So half sarcastically, half serious what Sean said, except I don't have nearly the leverage that he does.
Definitely makes sense. Smaller scale there. So I want to pivot a little bit to food waste, because that's definitely something that's not a good issue for anyone and can eat into prices and also can kind of gum up the supply chain. We're getting a question from the audience here, and I don't know how much you can speak on this, Sean. Related to food waste, I know Kroger has a Zero Hunger, Zero Waste initiative. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, it's a bold and ambitious goal, but something that fits in with our mission, which is to feed the human spirit, which shows up in many different ways. You think about the interactions that we have day to day with people. Sometimes we may be the only people that interact with that person in a day, and that's something that was very hard to achieve in a meaningful way throughout COVID, right? Even today, we still ask that all our associates wear masks to keep themselves and our customers and everybody safe. But, we talk about smiling with our eyes as much as we can, and trying to really just make somebody's day. And the most meaningful way we can do that is supporting organizations like we're talking to here today, with available food that's wholesome, that's nourishing, that's readily available too. And we put a lot of emphasis and pressure on our stores to ensure that we are donating at 100% of our availability to these programs. We operate 2,700 stores across the country, from as far northwest as Alaska to as far southeast as Savannah, Georgia. So we have many local food partners, food banks like the Free Store Food Bank that depend on us for donations, and we have very aggressive goals about how we want to provide support for them, but also at the same time, providing meals, and cash donations, supporting organizations in different ways as well. So it's really in the fabric of everything that we want to do. We don't think that any person should go hungry, and we don't think that any food should go wasted.
Thanks, Sean. And before we get to another question in the chat, Suzy, I just wanted you to comment on this as well. A lot of your day-to-day programming at Soupe is centered around food waste. What are some ways that folks in the community, or maybe some of the potential students on this call, could get involved with, tackling food waste with Soupe?
We have a program that now that we have the space to do this, it's called Cooking Improv. And it's a very basic knife skill class meant for anybody. It's a free class, but we centered around the waste factor, meaning whatever reason we got, I couldn't even tell you. I think it was 16 pallets of leeks last week. And so if we have all these leeks, what do you do with them? So the conversation, it's meant to be, you're chopping, you're slicing, you're dicing with us, and we're discussing different ways. There's no recipes given. It literally is just learning about the vegetable that you're cutting up. And they are helping us because what they cut goes back into the kitty, is what we call it. It goes into the kitty where the chefs can turn that into food. Then they make a small portion, they'll start talking and say, what about leek and potato soup? Or what about leek pancakes? Or what about, and then they'll make those as well. So everybody eats, everybody learns about it, about the different products and different ways you can tackle using it in a mindful way. And one of the things, I think one of the most beautiful things that had been said to us was, again, I hate to call it the have and have not, but we do have both around the same table. There are people that could afford to pay us for the class, but some are just neighborhood people that are interested in learning how to cook. But they also want to be part of giving back. And I think that's super important to understand, that just because you are using a food bank, given an opportunity to volunteer and help, and know that, yes, the people that come in are chopping with us and they're enjoying it, they're having fun, they're learning, but they also, the grin that they get is knowing that they were part of the solution and not just taking. And I think emotionally and mentally, it's super important to keep that in mind. So that's Cooking Improv. We do use a lot of volunteers in the kitchen, in packaging, in driving, in picking up. We have a team of about 400 volunteers at this point that we couldn't do our work without them. So, and we try to provide a fun and different kind of volunteer experience.
Perfect. And we'll also have links at the end of this session and on our website on how you can get involved with all three of these organizations. So be sure to check that out. I want to get to a question from the audience here. It's a good question here. So for any of you, operationally, do you foresee an end to COVID, which that's kind of loaded, but what lessons do you gain from the past 2 years that you think you will carry forward? So is there any realizations that you have from this experience of, we like to call pivoting, that you think that you're going to continue on with your organization? If anyone wants to go first.
Yeah, I don't know if any of us are qualified to answer, when the end of COVID is going to be.
I wish we knew.
We all I wish we knew, and we all wish it was.
Don't you know that?
Yeah. I hope it's very soon. I hope it's very, very soon. But I think what we've all learned is that, flexibility is the key to success and survival. We've used the word pivot so many times. That's probably the word of the year, honestly, is continuing to pivot. I think there's going to be some permanent changes that come out of this in the way that people behave and the way that they spend their time and where they spend their time. I think one of those is definitely, and something I'm experiencing today, is, working from home. I've never worked from home, in my life, but I think our company is going to make a permanent effort to allow flexibility for people to work from home, where it's possible. So when that occurs, that creates a change in consumer behavior. That means I eat out less for lunch. That means, I'm eating from home more. I'm not stopping by and picking up things, so that changes the way that I shop and I behave. And that's just one of, I think, many things that are changing with consumers. People are traveling less, but I think people have the itch to get out there and travel more eventually. So I think still TBD for a lot of things, if some of these temporary behavior changes are going to stay in place and what's going to be permanent. But definitely more to come. But flexibility will be key for all of us.
Thanks. Any other lessons that you guys wanted to share from your experiences?
Yeah, I think programmatically we saw. I hate to kind of use the same language, but it's absolutely true. A change in our consumers' behavior. We saw most of us adapted in the what used to be called the emergency food distribution world, and we're trying to rebrand that because there's some problematic language in there. But in the food access world, we quickly adapted to kind of this drive-through model for safety, for efficiency reasons. In the past, we had always kind of steered away from that because it got away from what we like to call client choice. But what we found is that within that, it provided some additional flexibility for individuals receiving food. So we do believe some of those drive-through models are definitely here to stay for a little bit, especially when we talk about our larger scale. Prior to COVID, our largest kind of off-site drive-through event were 100 to 200 families. We saw 2,500 families in the Thanksgiving and December holidays last year. So we definitely think that there's a good number of individuals who see value in kind of that drive-through model. And the other thing that we've really begun to see is a change in, even the language, right? I used emergency food distribution network in the past, and we're trying to rebrand that as food access, because what we found is that as COVID hit, people were in emergency and they got the food, but even though they still qualified and still needed it, what they began to do, we saw decreased usage of our services, both ours and our partners. And when we did some studies, what we found was that I can afford my groceries today. And one of my neighbors, one of my community members, they're still in emergency. So we found that people were still struggling to pay their bills and not getting their prescriptions, but they could get their food. So even the language of food access, we're modifying. We've adjusted our strategic plan to definitely include food access points, and that's not just like branding, but we're looking at the equitability of how we distribute food. So it was always, can we get how many millions of pounds out the door? But now we're looking at how do we serve the consumer where they're at. So to steal Kroger, how do we click list this? Right, because I think an element of retail is convenience. Can Mike Truitt pay the extra $5 to have the food, his grocery order picked up and available for him so he's in and out? Yes. I don't think that's going to go away. And even within the food access world, we know that people will sometimes take 2 and 3 buses each direction to the food pantry. That's hours and hours and hours. How do we provide families that opportunity of convenience so that maybe they don't have to take a day off work to get their groceries, whether it's from Kroger or from the local food pantry? What can we do to get them the food, the services in a manner that's equitable, so that, and just as convenient and just as available? So we've always had the food available at giant food pantries and all of that, but we are really trying to lean into and again pivot towards models that are more equitable and provide individuals more food access than just available.
And thank you for those reflections. There's a lot to think about there. Suzy, I'm going to give you a chance to answer as well. And I think you would also be great to answer this question. Looks like a follow-up to a previous question. Any thoughts on slow food and the local food movement, if you're familiar with that?
Oh, yeah. Actually, we were the Slow Food Snail Award winner a number of years ago.
Awesome.
I think the local food is critical to our supply chain here at Soupe, like I mentioned before. It's not like we intended to rely on local farmers, but they're the ones that really were there for us. And trying to set up systems utilizing these farmers now, because we know how important they are to the system. So we are forming a lot of alliances. We started a chapter here locally called the St. Andrew's Society. That is an area, it's a group of gleaners. So that's a really fun volunteer opportunity. I don't run it, it's not my program, but it's called St. Andrew's. And what they do is the local farmers in this tri-state area will say, I'm done picking corn, but there's plenty of corn out there. And the gleaners go out, they pick the corn, and then they give it to food pantries, us, all over the city where they can use it, so that local food is staying local. And I love that we finally have that here. I went out and did blueberries and what was I? Oh, potatoes, digging potatoes. Not an easy job, by the way. But it was fun. I learned stuff. And one of the programs we have is actually all about slow food, and it's called Cincinnati Gives a Crock. And it's, we recognized when we were teaching in the Cincinnati public schools, many, meaning 80% of the kids that we were teaching do not have access to stoves and ovens and even the pots and the pans necessary to produce the food. So why are we teaching them in that way? So I came up with a crock pot, and I still haven't really used one at home. I'm not a crock pot professional at all. But I thought, well, if we gave them all crock pots, the ultimate in slow food, and try to teach them how to use that, and you can make plenty of nourishing meals in the winter months especially. And it's turned into, we've given over, I think we're up to 500 crock pots now within Cincinnati's public school system. It's run by volunteers. It's a program that is becoming increasingly more and more difficult, just for lots of logistics. Every school in the city wants the program, but to find the volunteers that will commit to 8 weeks every Tuesday for 3 hours, it's tough. But we're still trying to, problem solve it, because we see the success and we see the repeat of the kids coming year after year. We start with 6th graders, and we started a program, I'm thinking it was 2016. And we're still, some of those kids are still in school and can't wait to get to crockpot class. So the ultimate slow cooker. So
that sounds like an awesome program. Thanks for sharing. I want to kind of turn things over to Sean, because I know Kroger has hundreds, if not thousands, of locations that might operate under different umbrellas depending on where you are in the country. But what commitments have you guys made recently to sourcing local? I know there might be a few initiatives out there that you use, even though supply chains might be challenging right now.
Yeah, traditionally, where local really started was within the produce, side of things. If you go into any of our stores, we typically talk about the local farmers that we partner with, with whatever crops are grown in that particular region. Seasonality plays a big part in that too. When things are within season. I lived in Tennessee for a while, and the big rage down there is Granger County tomatoes. And when it's Granger County tomato season, you want to make sure we have them first and they're fresh and ready to go. Olathe corn is another one of them. So produce has really been the area that's championed local. But most recently, we actually had kind of a contest called Go Fresh and Go Local, where we took submissions from around the country from local suppliers, wanting to pitch their products. And we set up a little bit of kind of like a Shark Tank atmosphere, and we videoed it, filmed it, had hair and makeup for the presenters and all that kind of fun stuff. And they presented their products, and we awarded 10 people with business, and are bringing their products into market, and really just having fun with it. It's the right thing to do, and it's honestly fun. I see somebody ask the question, why did you get into this, and why did you get into this industry? I think it's around food, fun, and people, honestly. That's something that I've always been interested in. My father was in the industry. And so I spent my youth growing up around grocery stores and talking with people and trying different foods. So I think a lot of that is just finding companies and people that have similar passion and interest and giving them an opportunity.
That's another awesome program, Sean. Thank you. And kind of our last question here. I know Sean answered this and kicked us off, but why this industry? What's kind of your draw to, Suzy, you had a career as a chef before this, and Mike, everything that you do with the Free Store Food Bank, what draws you to this type of work?
Who did you ask that to? I'm sorry.
Both of you, if you want to go first, or Michael, if you want to go first, either one.
Well, I'll just say for me, it was in my business, I saw so much waste. So I was primarily a high-end boutique caterer that was asked to supply beautiful, wonderful, high-end food for 200 buffet style. And if you're going through a buffet and you're the last one, you don't want your guests to feel like you're the last one. So you're going to prepare food for 225. What are you going to do with the 25 so that everybody has a full buffet experience? So it was driving me crazy for pretty much my entire life as a chef. I also am a product of European family. My father was French. He was a chef. My grandfather, they lived through World War II. We were very, very frugal, and I was taught waste-saving ways as a child. So it was a natural progression for me. And I think the startling statistic that 40% of the food is being thrown away in America at the same time that 40% of the kids in Cincinnati, at the time that I started, we were second behind Detroit in kids living in food insecurity. And to me, that was unacceptable. And I was kind of just thinking, I'm up for the challenge. I'm just going to kind of dip my toe and see what happens if I can try to help be part of a solution. So, and I do believe it is food after all. So why are chefs not getting involved in this was kind of a haunting thought to me. So.
Awesome. Yeah. And our last minute here, Mike, what draws you to this industry? What do you love most about what you do?
I've always been a little mission focused. So when I first started kind of my career post-college, I was in social services with mental health and substance use disorder, but kind of went back to school to get my master's. And so I've always been, I worked at that time, I worked very, very closely with the Free Store Food Bank. Prior to that, I had worked in retail with one of your competitors, one of Kroger's competitors for about 7 years there. So it was always there, but it was a job that just paid well more than anything else. But I distinctly remember working with one client at my time there, pretty severe mental illness, didn't remember his name most days, didn't know where he was born, didn't have any photo ID. So as you can imagine, struggled quite a bit with just daily activities. And I remember the first time that we were able to get him food stamps, just the feeling that he knew where his next meal was, and that kind of, in that I hate to get academic because I'm getting a little emotional, and that's my defense mechanism. He's meeting, like, knowing that I helped meet somebody's that Maslow hierarchy of needs, right? I'm not a doctor. I don't save people's lives. I'm not that talented, and I'm not that smart. But knowing that my efforts, that I can leverage who I am and my talents to help other people has always been something that I've held closely. I didn't come from a privileged life, so I've relied on the system a little bit from time to time. So knowing that I can give back to the community is definitely a powerful feeling every day.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that. So I just want to thank all three of you once again. I mean, what you guys were able to pull off in the middle of a pandemic and providing for our community is nothing short of amazing. So thank you so much for everything that you guys all do.